This is a tracing that you've seen, and it's associated with two intracardiac maneuvers. So this is the 12-lead ECG during tachycardia. This is right ventricular pacing from the apex, right ventricular pacing from the posturoseptal area. And a question is asked of you. The mechanism of tachycardia is most likely AV reentry, AV node reentry, or an atrial tachycardia. So let's start first with the 12-lead. What you see here is a regular, narrow, complex tachycardia with what has been called a long, here let's look into, a long RP interval. Now, some of you will see there may not be a P wave as well inscribed. Now that is just a factor of the ECG. Sometimes that'll happen that things will fall out. I can promise you there was a one-to-one relationship and the RP interval was always the same. So please don't get hung up on that. So this is a classic RP, long RP tachycardia. And in leads 2, 3, and AVF, you can see it's fairly broad. You can see that there's a broad P wave there. So this is suggesting this is not something in the anterior septum. Now, a long RP tachycardia, quite frankly, has multiple etiologies. And I don't know why people get so fascinated with the term long RP tachycardia, because it's not diagnostic. It's like saying someone has jaundice, now go figure it out. So long RP tachycardia could be AV node reentry with slow conduction retrograde, could be AV reentry with slow conduction retrograde, or simply an atrial tachycardia with the math working out that you have a shorter PR than a RP. So it's just an interesting observation, and you shouldn't get hung up on it. So let me tell you that during the case that I was doing, when I put in PVCs during tachycardia, which is what you should always do to try to figure these out in the lab, I could finally pre-excite the atrium, but not when a His bundle was still present. So when you get a very tight PVC that pre-excites the atrium, that does not allow you to make the usual claim that this is AV reentry, all right, because it could have gone up the AV node. So I did a maneuver, and that maneuver is called differential pacing. So let me walk you through it, and then let's look at those intervals again. If we assume that we're looking at either a fast, slow AV node reentry, in other words, a long retrograde conduction time to the atrium over the AV node versus a posturoseptal, for example, accessory pathway, what you need to do is pace from two different areas of the ventricle. So let's walk through that. So if I look in panel A and I pace from the apex and the posturoseptal area, if I have no accessory pathway, then this impulse has to travel all the way down here, follow the green line, and come all the way back here to get to either one of these points. Whereas if I pace at the apex, it's going to get there sooner. So if the VA interval during RV apical pacing is shorter than the VA interval during posturoseptal pacing, it implies you're coming up an AV node. But if I have a posturoseptal accessory pathway and I pace close to that pathway, my transit time to get there is relatively short versus starting at the apex and coming up. So if I have a shorter VA time from the posturoseptal area than the apex, that implies an accessory pathway is present. So let's go back to this patient. Remember, we could pre-excite, but only with a very early PVC. And that's when we were pacing from the apex. So when I pace from the apex here, if I just take any site here, the VA interval is 262. And if I look at the posturoseptum, aha, it's 214. That implies, but doesn't prove, but implies that you probably have a posturoseptal accessory pathway present. Now, some of you will say, hey, come on, you're already coming up the left, so didn't you know that to begin with? No. The answer to that is no. There are well-documented cases of AV node reentry where you get a breakout in the coronary sinus. So you can't look at that and assume that the answer is it's a left-sided pathway, because you'll have AV nodes where you'll be searching on the left side with your catheter and you'll never get a success. So you can still have eccentric activation and come up the AV node. It's important to prove things with maneuvers. So the answer here is most likely. I haven't proved it yet, but most likely we're dealing with an accessory pathway, and therefore most likely the answer is AV reciprocating tachycardia. Now, even though I couldn't get a PVC in to terminate tachycardia from the apex when I did my maneuvers, see what happens when you're close to the accessory pathway. So now I have my catheter in the posterior septum, and I didn't show you this before, but here's what happened. A very late PVC, because I'm close to the pathway, right? I'm close to the circuit. You can even still see the His. Terminates tachycardia without going to the atrium when the His bundle is refractory, one of the second proofs that an accessory pathway is not only present, but participates in tachycardia. So the answer was AV reentry, and the patient underwent a successful ablation.